What happens when a man who has everything realizes he's about to lose the only thing that ever mattered? Damian Sterling, a name synonymous with power and wealth, walked into court that morning believing he was closing a chapter. Divorcing his wife was just another line item on his agenda, a calculated severance of a failed merger. He was prepared for legal arguments, for crocodile tears, for a fight over his fortune, but he wasn't prepared for her. And he certainly wasn't prepared for the tiny, blue-eyed secret she held in her arms. A secret that was about to shatter his world and expose a devastating betrayal that went deeper than he could ever imagine. The marble floors of the New York County Courthouse gleamed under the recessed lighting, reflecting the cold, impassive face of Damian Sterling. At 36, he had the kind of severe, chiseled looks that artists tried to capture in stone. Sharp jaw, intense gray eyes, and a mouth that rarely curved into a smile. His suit, a bespoke creation by Tom Ford, was the color of charcoal and probably cost more than the average car. It was armor and he wore it well. To him, this day was an unfortunate necessity, like a hostile takeover that had become messy. His marriage to Isabella Rossi had been, in his estimation, a mistake, a brief, passionate lapse in judgment. He'd been captivated by her fire, her work as an art restorer who saw beauty in broken things, a stark contrast to the polished, pedigreed women of his circle. But passion, he'd learned, was a volatile asset. It didn't hold up on a balance sheet. His lawyer, Arthur Harrington, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the concerns of the 1%, stood beside him, murmuring final instructions. It should be straightforward, Damian. The prenuptial agreement is ironclad. She gets the settlement we agreed upon, and we all walk away clean. Clean, Damian repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. There was nothing clean about this. He glanced across the grand hall, and then he saw her, Isabella. She wasn't the vibrant woman he had married. The past year of separation had taken its toll. She looked thinner, and there were faint shadows under her warm brown eyes. She wore a simple navy blue dress, a stark contrast to the designer gowns he had once draped her in. Yet there was a new steel in her spine, a quiet resilience that hadn't been there before. Her lawyer, a sharp-looking woman named Sarah Jenkins, stood protectively by her side. For a disorienting second, Damian felt a pang of something he refused to name. He crushed it instantly. This was business. He had been betrayed. His mother, Catherine Sterling, had made sure he saw the truth. Isabella's lavish spending, her unsuitable friends, the whispers of her intentions. He had believed it all because it fit the narrative he understood. Everyone wanted a piece of the Sterling empire. All rise, the bailiff's voice echoed, and they filed into the courtroom. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and stale justice. Damian took his seat at the plaintiff's table, his posture rigid. He refused to look at her again. He focused on the judge, an older man with a weary expression who had likely seen 1,000 stories like theirs. The proceedings began, a drone of legal jargon that was the soundtrack to the dismantling of a life they had once planned together. When the matter of Sterling versus Rossi Sterling, petition for dissolution of marriage, Damian's mind drifted, calculating the cost of the settlement against his quarterly earnings. It was a rounding error. He just wanted it over. Then a slight commotion at the back of the courtroom drew his attention. A side door opened, and Isabella, who had been seated in the gallery, rose and walked towards the counsel's table. But she wasn't alone. In her arms, she held a baby carrier, blankets tucked securely around a small form. A murmur rippled through the room. Arthur Harrington shot Damian a confused, panicked look. "What is this?" he hissed under his breath. Damian couldn't answer. His entire world had tilted on its axis. His gaze was locked on the carrier. Isabella reached the table and, with a steady hand, lifted the baby out. The child was small, wrapped in a soft yellow blanket, with a tuft of dark hair visible. Sarah Jenkins, Isabella's lawyer, addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we apologize for the interruption. My client's childcare arrangements fell through at the last minute. She has no one else." The judge looked annoyed but nodded curtly. "Proceed." Isabella settled into her chair, the baby nestled against her chest. From his angle, Damian could only see the back of the child's head, but it was enough to send a cold dread snaking through his veins. A baby. Where had a baby come from? They had been separated for over a year. He did the math, his mind racing. It was possible. He felt a primal urge to stand up, to shout, but he was frozen in place. The proceedings continued, but the words were a meaningless blur. All he could hear was the frantic pounding of his own heart. Then, as if sensing the tension in the room, the baby stirred. Isabella adjusted him, turning slightly in her seat. For the first time, Damien saw the child's face, and the world stopped. It wasn't just the tuft of dark hair, so like his own. It wasn't the shape of the nose or the curve of the tiny mouth. It was the eyes. The baby blinked open his eyes, and Damien found himself staring into a miniature reflection of himself. They were the unmistakable Sterling eyes, a rare, stormy gray that had been passed down through generations. His father had them. He had them. His breath hitched in his throat. Every calculated thought, every business decision, every ounce of his legendary self-control evaporated. He was no longer a billionaire in a courtroom. He was just a man, staring at a ghost, at a possibility that ripped through the fabric of his reality. The baby. His baby. The judge was speaking to him. Mr. Sterling, the court is asking if you agree to the terms of the settlement as outlined. Damien didn't hear him. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the child. He slowly rose to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The entire courtroom fell silent. All eyes were on him. Arthur Harrington grabbed his arm. Damien, sit down. What are you doing? He shook him off. His voice, when it came out, was a raw, strangled whisper that carried through the silent room. Isabella, he said, his voice cracking. Who is that baby? Their beginning felt like a fairy tale, spun from champagne and stolen glances at a Sotheby's auction. Damien was there to acquire a Rothko, another jewel for his corporate collection. Isabella was there consulting on the restoration of a 17th century Baroque painting. He saw her from across the room, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, a smudge of what looked like gold leaf on her cheek. She wasn't looking at the bitters or the art on the walls. She was looking at the art on the ceiling, a forgotten fresco with an expression of pure, unadulterated wonder. In a world of calculated moves and transactional relationships, her sincerity was a force of nature. He, a man who could buy anything, was utterly captivated by a woman who found value in things no one else noticed. Their courtship was a whirlwind. He flew her to Florence to see the Uffizi Gallery, not on his private jet, but on a commercial flight, sitting beside her in coach because she insisted. She made him dinner in her tiny Brooklyn apartment, a simple pasta dish that tasted better than anything he'd ever eaten at per se. She knew nothing of his net worth, only that he worked in acquisitions, and she didn't seem to care. She was interested in the books he read, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his late father's love for sailing, the hidden vulnerability he kept locked away behind a fortress of wealth. He fell for her harder and faster than he'd ever fallen for a stock price. He felt seen, not for the sterling name, but for the man he rarely allowed himself to be. He proposed 6 months later on a sailboat in the middle of the Mediterranean, under a sky full of stars. The moment she said yes, he felt an unfamiliar surge of pure, unalloyed happiness. Then he brought her home. The Sterling ancestral mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, was less a home and more a monument to dynastic power. It was there that Isabella met Catherine Sterling. Catherine was elegance personified, a woman sculpted from ice and old money. From the very first handshake, her smile never quite reached her eyes. Rossi, Catherine had mused, testing the name on her tongue as if it were an unfamiliar wine. Italian. How vibrant. The subtle cuts began almost immediately. Catherine would helpfully point out that Isabella's choice of dress for a charity gala was perhaps too bold. She would reminisce endlessly about Damien's late sister Diana, a paragon of quiet grace, implying Isabella could never measure up. When Isabella redecorated a guest room, filling it with warm colors and personal touches, Catherine remarked that it was charming in a provincial sort of way. Damien, blinded by love and conditioned to see his mother as the infallible matriarch of their family, missed the malice. He saw it as Catherine's way of guiding Isabella, of helping her acclimate to a world that was notoriously unforgiving. "She's just trying to help, Izzy," he'd say, kissing her forehead. "This world is different. She just wants you to be comfortable." But Isabella was never comfortable. She felt like a beautiful bird Damien had placed in a gilded cage, and his mother was the one who kept rattling the bars. The real poison began to seep in after the wedding. Damien was consumed by a massive international merger, working 18-hour days and flying between New York and Tokyo. He grew distant, retreating into the cold, logical world of business, where he felt most in control. He became the man he was in the courtroom: impersonal, detached, and suspicious. Catherine used his absence to her advantage. She began planting seeds of doubt in his mind during their brief phone calls. "I do worry about Isabella, dear," she'd say with a sigh. "She seems a bit lost." The platinum card saw quite a bit of activity at Bergdorf's today. "Of course, she deserves to treat herself, but I just hope she understands the value of things." It was a lie. Isabella had bought a simple gift for her own mother, but Catherine framed it as a profligate shopping spree. Another time it was, a friend of hers called the house today, a man, an old artist friend from her Brooklyn days. They spoke for quite some time. It's wonderful she's keeping her own connections, of course. The friend was a married elderly mentor, but in Catherine's telling, it became a clandestine call from a former lover. Damien, stressed and exhausted, started to believe it. Isabella, his vibrant, genuine Isabella, was becoming a caricature in his mind, the gold digger his mother had subtly warned him about all along. His own insecurities, the deep-seated fear that people only wanted him for his money, were a fertile ground for Catherine's poison. The final explosive argument happened on a cold November night. He just returned from a week-long trip to find a bill from a renowned fertility clinic on his desk. He and Isabella had talked about starting a family, a conversation that now felt like it belonged to two different people. He had been hesitant, haunted by the loss of his sister years ago, a tragedy that had fractured his family. But Isabella had been hopeful. Catherine had found the bill first. By the time Damien saw it, his mother had already framed the narrative. "She's trying to trap you, Damien," she'd said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "An heir is the ultimate insurance policy." That night, he confronted Isabella. He didn't ask, he accused. "How much is enough, Isabella?" he sneered, tossing the bill onto the polished mahogany table between them. "First the clothes, the jewelry, and now this? You think a baby's going to secure your future in this family?" Isabella stared at him, her face pale with shock. "Damien, what are you talking about? We discussed this. I thought it was what we both wanted. I wanted a wife, not a business partner looking for her next payout." The words were cruel, fueled by months of his mother's insidious whispers. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady, laced with a pain that was deeper than anger. "I never, ever cared about your money. I fell in love with a man on a sailboat who looked at the stars, not his stock portfolio. I don't even know who you are anymore." "And I don't know you," he shot back, his voice cold and final. "Maybe I never did." The silence that followed was cavernous. In that moment, something beautiful between them shattered irrevocably. "I want you to leave," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She just looked at him, a profound sadness in her eyes, as if she was seeing him clearly for the very first time. She nodded once, turned, and walked out of the room. The next morning she was gone. She took nothing but the clothes she had arrived with and a small box of personal mementos. He told himself it was for the best. He told himself it was a clean break. He had no idea that she had left with something else entirely, a tiny secret piece of him, a new life just beginning to grow. The silence of her small, one-bedroom apartment in Queens was a stark contrast to the echoing emptiness of the Greenwich mansion. In the beginning, the quiet was a physical weight, pressing down on Isabella. The grief of her failed marriage was a raw, open wound. Some days she could barely summon the energy to get out of bed. She would sit by the window watching the bustling, anonymous life of the city unfold below, feeling utterly alone. She had walked away from Damien's world with her dignity intact, but little else. The generous settlement offer his lawyers had sent was still sitting, unsigned, on her kitchen counter. She refused to touch it. Taking his money felt like an admission that he had been right about her, and she would rather starve. She found a part-time job at a small, independent art gallery in Soho, run by a kind older woman named Evelyn. It was a return to the world she loved, a world of texture and color and history. The smell of oil paint and old canvas was a balm to her soul. She poured her energy into her work, meticulously restoring a collection of damaged portraits, finding solace in mending what was broken. It was during a long, grueling afternoon of mixing pigments that the first wave of nausea hit her. She dismissed it as stress or a stomach bug. But when it persisted for over a week, a terrifying, exhilarating possibility began to dawn on her. Her hands trembled as she looked at the small plastic stick on her bathroom sink. 2 pink lines. Pregnant. Her first reaction wasn't joy, but a tidal wave of panic. She sank to the floor, her hand flying to her still flat stomach. A baby. Damien's baby. A child conceived in the last hopeful days of their marriage, before the final, ugly accusations had torn everything apart. Her immediate instinct was to call him. Despite the pain, he was the father. He had a right to know. She picked up her phone, his number still at the top of her recent calls list, a painful reminder of how quickly everything had changed. But then she hesitated. What would he say? She could hear his voice in her head, cold and laced with suspicion. A baby? How convenient, Isabella. Is this your final play for the sterling fortune? He wouldn't see a child. He would see a chess piece, a leverage point. And worse, what about his mother? Catherine would swoop in, casting her long shadow over this child's life, either trying to buy Isabella off or using her army of lawyers to take the baby away, convinced she was rescuing a sterling heir from his unsuitable mother. The thought terrified her more than anything. This child was not a pawn. This child was hers, a tiny, innocent life that deserved to be surrounded by love, not suspicion and legal battles. That night she made a decision. It was the hardest decision of her life, born of both love and fear. She would do this alone. She would protect her child from the toxicity of the sterling name. She never signed the settlement papers. Instead, she took on extra restoration projects, working late into the night until her back ached and her vision blurred. She sold the few pieces of jewelry Damien had given her that held no sentimental value, using the money to pay for prenatal vitamins and doctor's visits. She found a small clinic in her neighborhood where she was just another patient, not the former wife of a billionaire. Her friend and boss, Evelyn, was her rock. "You are the strongest woman I know," Evelyn told her, her eyes full of warmth as she helped Isabella set up a small, second-hand crib in the corner of her bedroom. The pregnancy was difficult. The doctors diagnosed her with a potential complication, a rare condition that required careful monitoring. It was a lonely journey, filled with late-night fears and solitary appointments in sterile waiting rooms. But every time she felt the baby kick, a fierce, protective love would surge through her, reaffirming her decision. This was her purpose now. She named him Leonardo, after Da Vinci, the master of art and invention. She called him Leo. He was born on a rainy Tuesday in June at Elmhurst Hospital. When the nurses placed him in her arms, a tiny, perfect creature with a shocking tuft of dark hair, Isabella wept. They were tears of exhaustion, of relief, and of overwhelming, unconditional love. As he grew in those first few months, his features began to solidify. And then she saw it. The eyes. They weren't her warm brown, but a startling, stormy gray. They were Damien's eyes. Every time Leo looked at her, it was a reminder of the man she had loved and the life they could have had. It was a constant, bittersweet ache in her heart. She created a small, safe world for Leo. Their life was simple, devoid of luxury, but rich in a way the Sterling mansion had never been. It was filled with lullabies, trips to the park, the scent of baby powder, and the sound of her son's happy gurgles. But as the date for the final divorce hearing approached, a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Her lawyer, Sarah Jenkins, had warned her it was a formality she couldn't avoid. She had no intention of bringing Leo, planning to leave him with Evelyn. But on the morning of the hearing, Leo woke up with a high fever. He was crying, miserable, and clinging to her. Evelyn, whose husband had just had a fall, had to cancel. Isabella had no one else. Panic set in. She couldn't miss the hearing. A bench warrant could be issued. With a heavy heart and no other choice, she packed Leo's diaper bag, bundled him into his carrier, and prayed that she could keep him quiet and unnoticed in the back of the courtroom. She prayed Damien wouldn't see him, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, the sound echoing the fracture in Damien's composure. Recess. Counsel for both parties will meet me in my chambers. Now. The courtroom buzzed like a disturbed hive. Reporters who had caught wind of the high-profile divorce were already scribbling furiously. Damien stood frozen, his eyes still locked on Isabella and the child, his child. Arthur Harrington practically had to drag him towards the heavy oak door leading to the judge's private chambers. Isabella followed, her face a mask of pale resolve, Leo now sleeping soundly against her shoulder. Her lawyer, Sarah Jenkins, walked beside her, a protective hand on her back. The chambers were a small, suffocating room lined with leather-bound legal books that seemed to absorb all the sound. Judge Miller, his face grim, sat behind his desk, steepling his fingers. "Close the door," he commanded, "and someone better start explaining what in the hell is going on. Mr. Harrington, your client looks like he's seen a ghost." Before Arthur could formulate a response, Damien's voice cut through the tension, low and dangerous. "Is he mine, Isabella?" Isabella flinched but met his gaze. The defiance was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. "Yes, Damien, he's yours." The admission hit him like a physical blow. A son. He had a son. For 10 months he'd had a son, and he hadn't known. A storm of emotions, rage, betrayal, and a profound, aching loss warred within him. "Why?" he demanded, taking a step toward her. "Why wouldn't you tell me? Was this your trump card? Were you going to wait until the last minute to spring him on me for a bigger settlement?" The cruel words were out of his mouth before he could stop them, a reflexive return to the ugly suspicions that had ended their marriage. Isabella recoiled as if he had slapped her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. It was her lawyer who answered, her voice cold as ice. "She didn't tell you, Mr. Sterling," Sarah Jenkins said, stepping forward slightly, "because you and your mother made it perfectly clear that any child she had would be seen as nothing more than a commodity. A negotiating tactic, I believe, was the phrase you used." Damien stared at her, the memory of his own vile words from that last night echoing in his ears. "I kept him a secret to protect him," Isabella said, her voice trembling but clear. "I wanted him to be loved for who he is, not for the name he carries. I didn't want him raised in a world where his own grandmother would see him as an insurance policy, and his own father would see him as a weapon used against him. I wanted to give him a life, Damien, not a trust fund." She spoke of her solitary pregnancy, the medical scares, the fear of raising him alone, and the peace she had finally found. Every word was a testament to a strength he had never known she possessed. He had seen her as weak, as an opportunist. He had been so wrong. "That's a very touching story," Arthur Harrington interjected, ever the pragmatist. "But it doesn't change the fact that my client was denied his right to know his own child." "Oh, I think you'll find he was more than just denied that right," Sarah Jenkins said, a sharp glint in her eye. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a slim file folder, placing it on the judge's desk. "Your Honor, we have evidence that there was a concerted, deliberate effort to conceal the existence of this child from Mr. Sterling, just not by my client." She slid a series of printed documents across the polished wood. Damien leaned forward. They were emails. The first was from a generic Gmail account to Isabella, dated a month after their separation. "I know about your condition," it read. "A generous offer will be made to you if you agree to handle this discreetly and disappear. Do not contact Damien. It will not end well for you." The next was a bank statement showing a wire transfer of $50,000 into Isabella's account, which was then immediately transferred back to the source account. "My client refused the money," Sarah explained. Then came the text messages, screen captured and printed. They were more direct, more threatening. "You think you're clever, but you're playing a game you can't win. Stay away from my son. Do you have any idea what our lawyers would do to a girl like you in court? They would paint you as an unfit, scheming tramp. You would never see that baby again." Damien's blood ran cold. He knew the tone. He knew the ruthless, clinical cruelty. "Who sent these?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah Jenkins looked him directly in the eye. The emails were traced back to a disposable IP address, but the texts were sent from a burner phone that we have on record being purchased for cash by your mother's personal driver 2 days before the first message was sent. The room fell silent. Judge Miller looked from the papers to Damien, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't just threats," Sarah continued, her voice relentless. "We have a sworn affidavit from a nurse at the prenatal clinic my client attended. She states that a woman fitting the description of Catherine Sterling approached her and offered her a substantial amount of money for Isabella's medical records." A gasp escaped Isabella's lips. She hadn't known that part. Damien felt the floor drop out from under him. His mother. She had known. The whole time she had known Isabella was pregnant. She had not only hidden it from him, but had actively terrorized the woman carrying her grandchild. The web of lies she had spun about Isabella's spending, her supposed infidelity, wasn't just manipulation. It was a calculated campaign to sever him from his own child before he was even born. He looked at Isabella, truly looked at her, and saw not a schemer, but a victim. A woman who had been trying to shield her son from the monster he had failed to see in his own family. And he had helped. He had been the weapon his mother used against her. The rage he had felt just moments before curdled into a sickening wave of self-loathing. "Your Honor," Arthur Harrington began, his face pale, "these are shocking allegations. We would need time to verify." "They're true," Damien said, his voice flat and dead. He didn't need to verify anything. It all clicked into place. His mother's smug satisfaction when he told her the divorce was final, her constant insistence that he move on and find someone suitable. She wasn't just protecting her son, she was curating a dynasty, and Isabella and her baby had no part in her vision. He sank into a chair, the full weight of his mother's betrayal and his own catastrophic failure of judgment crashing down on him. He had lost his wife and nearly lost his son, all because he had trusted the wrong woman. Damien left the courthouse in a fog. He didn't speak to Arthur, didn't acknowledge the reporter shouting his name. He got into the back of his waiting Maybach and gave his driver a single clipped command. "Take me to my mother's house." The drive to Greenwich was a blur of autumn foliage that he didn't see. He saw Isabella's face, etched with pain. He saw his son's gray eyes. He saw the cold, calculated words in his mother's texts. The family legacy he had been raised to protect felt like a shroud, woven from lies and cruelty. He stormed into the mansion, the heavy front doors slamming shut behind him. He found his mother in the solarium, calmly sipping tea and reading the Wall Street Journal. She looked up, a perfectly manicured eyebrow raised at his disheveled appearance. "Damien, darling, I thought you'd be in court all day. I trust it all went smoothly?" she asked, her voice as serene as the porcelain teacup in her hand. "Smoothly?" He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made her flinch. "You could say that. Tell me, Mother, how long have you known I have a son?" Catherine's composure finally cracked. A flicker of panic crossed her features before being replaced by a mask of steel. She placed her cup down with a delicate click. "I don't know what you're talking about. It seems that little tramp has finally played her pathetic card." "Don't you dare call her that," Damien snarled, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. He threw a copy of the evidence Sarah Jenkins had provided onto the glass table between them. The papers scattered, a testament to her treachery. "Threats? Bribes? You terrorized a pregnant woman, the woman carrying your own grandchild." Catherine stared at the papers, her face pale but defiant. "I did what was necessary to protect you, to protect this family. She was a nobody, a common little gold digger who saw you as a winning lottery ticket. A baby would have tethered you to her for life. I saved you from your own mistake." "You didn't save me," he roared, his control finally snapping. "You lied to me. You manipulated me. You turned me against my own wife and hid my son from me. That isn't protection, Mother. That's possession. That's poison." "She was never good enough for you," Catherine insisted, her voice rising, all pretense of calm gone. She didn't understand our world, our responsibilities. Diana would have understood. Diana, leave Diana out of this. Damien cut her off. The mention of his late sister, a knife in his gut. Diana is gone. And because of you, I almost lost the only family I have left. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a cold, devastating clarity. He looked at the woman who had raised him and saw a stranger, a person whose love was so twisted and conditional it had become a destructive force. Just then his phone buzzed. It was his longtime executive assistant and the closest thing he had to a friend, Ben Carter. Damien ignored it, but it buzzed again, insistently. He answered, turning away from his mother. Not now, Ben, he said curtly. Sir, you need to hear this. Ben's voice was urgent. It's about your mother. After you left for the courthouse, something felt wrong. I've been looking into some things. Mrs. Sterling hired a private investigator to follow Isabella after she left you. I managed to get the operative's reports from a contact. Damien's blood froze. What did they say? They confirm everything Isabella's lawyer said, Ben explained. She lived a quiet life, worked at a gallery, never saw anyone. But there's more. Something I think your mother deliberately hid from you. There was a pause. The PI followed Isabella to her doctor's appointments. She was seeing a specialist at Lenox Hill, a maternal fetal medicine expert. According to the investigator's notes, which include medical billing codes he saw in her paperwork, she was being treated for a high-risk pregnancy due to a factor V Leiden mutation. Damien staggered back, grabbing the edge of the table for support. Factor V Leiden, a rare genetic blood clotting disorder. The word struck him like a physical blow. His sister, Diana, had died from a pulmonary embolism at the age of 22. It was only after her death that the family learned she had carried the same rare, hereditary mutation, a mutation that Damien also carried. It was a closely guarded family secret, a source of immense grief and fear. It meant that any child he had could inherit it, and any woman carrying that child would be at an extremely high risk. His mother had known. The PI's report meant that Catherine knew Isabella was not just pregnant, but was navigating a dangerous, high-risk pregnancy alone. She knew Isabella's life and the life of her grandchild were in jeopardy, and not only did she do nothing to help, she actively added to her stress with threats and intimidation. The cruelty of it was monstrous, beyond anything he could have imagined. He ended the call, his hand trembling. He turned back to his mother, his face a mask of cold fury. Factor V Leiden, he said, the words falling like chips of ice into the silent room. Catherine visibly flinched. The last vestiges of her defiance crumbled, replaced by pure, unadulterated fear. She knew she was caught. You knew, Damien stated, his voice devoid of all emotion. You knew she had a high-risk pregnancy because of a genetic condition she inherited from me, the same condition that killed your daughter. And you left her to fend for herself. You let her risk her life and our son's life, all to protect the family? He let out a hollow laugh. There is no family, not anymore. You destroyed it. He walked toward the door, his steps heavy. Damien, wait, she cried, finally getting to her feet. Where are you going? He stopped, his back to her. I'm going to find my son, and as for you, you will have no part in his life, or in mine. The lawyers you're so fond of using against others, you'll be hearing from them. I'm removing you from the board of the company and cutting you off completely. You are no longer my mother. You are just the woman who tried to destroy my life. He walked out, leaving Catherine Sterling alone in her magnificent sun-filled room, a fallen queen amidst the ruins of her own creation. The address Ben sent him was for a walk-up apartment building in Astoria, Queens. The contrast between the imposing stone facade of his mother's mansion and the humble brick front of this building was a visceral representation of the two worlds that had collided. Damien stood on the sidewalk for a long time, the engine of his Maybach silent behind him. He had dismissed his driver, needing to make this journey alone. He wore the same expensive suit from the courthouse, but it now felt like a costume, alien and absurd. He was an intruder here, a man from another planet. What was he even going to say? Sorry I let my mother terrorize you and accused you of being a gold digger while you were secretly carrying my son through a high-risk pregnancy? The words were inadequate, Obscene. Finally, he forced himself to move. He walked up the 3 flights of stairs, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. The hallway smelled of garlic and lemon-scented cleaner. He found apartment 3B and hesitated, his hand hovering over the door. He could hear the faint sound of a lullaby being hummed inside. He knocked softly. The humming stopped. A few seconds later, the door opened a crack, held by a chain lock. Isabella's wary brown eyes peered out at him. She looked exhausted, her face pale, but her arms were protectively wrapped around Leo, who was nestled against her chest in a baby carrier. "Damien," she whispered, her voice laced with apprehension. "What are you doing here?" Can I come in?" he asked, his own voice sounding foreign to him. "Please, Isabella, just for a minute." She hesitated for a long moment, then slowly closed the door, slid the chain off, and opened it fully. She didn't invite him in so much as retreat, leaving him to step inside and close the door behind him. The apartment was small but clean and bright. The afternoon light streamed through the single large window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The living room was also a nursery. The second-hand crib he'd heard about was in the corner, a handmade mobile of felt stars and moons hanging above it. There were framed photos on the wall, ultrasound pictures, a photo of a newborn Leo's tiny hand gripping Isabella's finger. It was a shrine to a life he had been completely absent from. A life built not with sterling money but with pure, unadulterated love. "I am so sorry, Isabella," he began, the words feeling small and hollow in the quiet room. "There are no words. Nothing I can say will ever be enough to excuse what I did, what I allowed to happen." She watched him, her expression unreadable, rocking Leo gently. "I believed her," he continued, the confession tearing at his insides. "My mother. I let her poison my mind against you. I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I saw everything through the lens of money and power, and I couldn't see the truth right in front of me. I couldn't see you." He took a hesitant step closer. "And the pregnancy, what Ben told me about the risk. Izzy, if anything had happened to you..." He couldn't finish the sentence. The thought was a black hole that threatened to swallow him whole. Tears streamed down his face then, hot and shameful. The unflappable Damien Sterling, the titan of industry, was weeping in a tiny Queen's apartment. He wasn't performing. He wasn't negotiating. He was simply broken. Isabella watched his apology unfold, her own eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She had dreamed of this moment, of him seeing the truth, but she had never imagined it would be like this. She saw not the powerful billionaire who had cast her out, but the vulnerable man she had once fallen in love with, the man who loved sailing and old books. Leo stirred against her chest, letting out a small, sleepy sigh. "Can I?" Damien asked, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze fixed on his son. "Can I hold him?" It was the most important question he had ever asked. Isabella looked from Damien's tear-streaked face to the peaceful face of her child. She saw the same gray eyes, the same dark hair. This man, for all his catastrophic flaws, was her son's father, and Leo deserved to know him. Slowly she nodded. She showed him how to hold his head, how to support his small body. Damien's hands, which were so accustomed to signing multi-billion-dollar deals, trembled as he took the small, warm weight of his son into his arms for the first time. Leo blinked open his sleepy, stormy gray eyes and looked up at his father. He didn't cry. He simply stared, his expression one of placid curiosity. Damien looked down at the tiny, perfect face, at the miniature version of his own features, and a love so fierce and absolute it stole his breath crashed over him. This was his son, his and Isabella's. A miracle he had almost thrown away. He sank onto the edge of her small sofa, cradling Leo against his chest, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He wasn't crying for the lost time, or for his mother's betrayal, or for his own stupidity. He was crying with the sheer, overwhelming relief of a man who had been given a second chance he in no way deserved. Isabella sat down beside him, not touching him, but her presence was a quiet anchor in his storm. In that moment, in the silence of the sun-drenched room, a new fragile chapter began. It wasn't about forgiveness, not yet. It was about something much more fundamental. The unspoken apology of a father holding his son for the very first time. The divorce proceedings were not just halted, they were entirely withdrawn. In their place, a new set of legal documents was drawn up, but these were not about dissolution, they were about creation. At Damien's insistence, his lawyers, under the strict supervision of Sarah Jenkins, drafted a comprehensive co-parenting agreement and a trust for Leo. It wasn't the hush money settlement Isabella had rejected, it was a plan for a future. Damien bought the entire apartment building in Astoria, not as a grand gesture of wealth, but as a practical one. He transferred ownership of the deed to Isabella, ensuring she and Leo would always have a stable, secure home that was truly theirs, free from any connection to the Sterling name. He kept a small, unassuming unit for himself on the ground floor, a place where he could be a father without the trapping of his other life. True to his word, he systematically dismantled his mother's influence. He called an emergency board meeting for Sterling Industries. With his controlling shares, he swiftly and unanimously voted Catherine off the board she had occupied for 40 years. He froze her access to the family accounts and changed the locks on the Greenwich mansion. The news sent shockwaves through the high society circles they inhabited. Catherine Sterling, the untouchable queen, had been dethroned by her own son. She was left with a modest trust from her own parents, but her power, her identity, was gone. She had become, in the end, a nobody. But Damien's biggest transformation was internal. The man who lived and breathed for the deal, the acquisition, the win, began to cede control. He promoted his most trusted deputies, delegated responsibilities he had once hoarded, and began leaving the office at 5 o'clock. His calendar, once packed with board meetings and international flights, now had new, non-negotiable appointments. Leo's checkup, tummy time, park with Izzy. The first few weeks were awkward. He and Isabella navigated a fragile truce, their interactions polite and focused solely on Leo. He would come over to her apartment, and she would show him how to change a diaper, how to warm a bottle, how to distinguish a hungry cry from a tired one. He was a clumsy but eager student. He learned the words to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and discovered the exact spot on Leo's back that, when patted, would produce a contented gurgle. One afternoon, while Isabella was sketching in a notepad, Damien was on the floor making a silly face at Leo, who responded with his first real laugh. A sudden, delightful burst of pure joy. Damien froze, his eyes wide with wonder. He looked over at Isabella, a genuine, unforced smile spreading across his face. She looked back, and for the first time since that terrible night, she smiled too. It was a small thing, a fleeting moment, but it felt like the first ray of sun after a long, brutal winter. He started courting her again, but not with grand gestures. There were no private jets or diamond necklaces. Instead, he showed up one morning with coffee from her favorite little shop in Brooklyn. He learned how to cook the simple pasta dish she had once made for him, filling her small apartment with the aroma of garlic and basil. He would sit with her in the evenings after Leo was asleep, and they would talk, really talk. He told her about his sister, about the guilt and grief he had carried for years, and how that loss had made him afraid to love, afraid to build a family. She told him about her lonely nights, her fears for their son, and the quiet strength she had found in motherhood. They were not fixing what was broken. They were building something new on a foundation of honesty and painful truth. The gilded cage was gone, replaced by the simple, sturdy walls of a small queen's apartment. Months later, on a warm spring day, they were at the park. Damien was pushing Leo on a baby swing, his deep laughter mingling with his son's happy squeals. Isabella sat on a nearby bench, watching them. The man before her was not the cold, suspicious billionaire she had left, nor the broken man who had shown up at her door. He was someone new, a father, a partner. He was the man she had first fallen in love with, tempered and changed by his mistakes. He caught her eye and beckoned her over. She walked to the swing set, and he wrapped a casual, comfortable arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They stood there together, a family of 3, watching their son swing back and forth, his little legs kicking with delight. "He looks happy," Damien said quietly, his voice full of a contentment she had never heard before. Isabella leaned her head against his shoulder. "We all are," she replied. The past was not forgotten, but its wounds were finally starting to heal. The future was unwritten, but for the first time in a very long time, it looked bright. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of betrayal, loss, and the incredible power of a second chance. Damien and Isabella's story reminds us that true wealth isn't measured in stock portfolios or mansions, but in honesty, trust, and the unbreakable bond of family. It shows that even the most devastating mistakes can be overcome when we have the courage to face the truth, apologize for our wrongs, and fight for what truly matters. We saw a man who had everything realize the only thing he ever truly needed was the family he almost destroyed. If this story of redemption and a father's love moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. What did you think of Damien's transformation? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a powerful story of real-life drama in heart. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible tale. Thanks for listening.